Ground crew in New Guinea swarm a battle-worn P-38 Lightning for repairs, exemplifying the unsung labor behind every flight. Technical Sergeant James McKenna wiped sweat from his brow in the muggy dawn of August 17, 1943. At Dobadura Airfield, New Guinea, the air droned with the sound of twin Allison engines as pilots ran up their P-38 Lightnings for a morning mission freerepublic.com. McKenna, a veteran crew chief with the 5th Air Force, crouched under the wing of Lieutenant Fred Hayes' plane, conducting last-minute checks. The Lightning was America's formidable twin-boomed fighter, fast, heavily armed, and endowed with unmatched range. Yet McKenna's experienced eyes lingered on a nagging flaw. As Hayes moved the control yoke in pre-flight, McKenna noticed a slight lag in the ailerons. The control cables had a bit of slack, perhaps only 3/8 of an inch of free play, but enough that the pilot's initial stick movement did nothing at all. freerepublic.com. In countless dogfights, that fractional delay between a pilot's input and the plane's response could mean life or death. And indeed, in recent months, too many young P-38 pilots had failed to return, shot down despite flying one of the U.S. Army Air Force's most advanced fighters. High command blamed pilot error or improper tactics. Maintenance manuals insisted the cable tension was within specifications, and engineering officers shrugged it off as an acceptable tolerance. freerepublic.com. But McKenna wasn't convinced. He'd seen too many flag-draped coffins to accept that all those losses were simply due to pilot mistakes. Perhaps, he thought, the devil was in the details of the machine itself. McKenna's mind flashed back to the previous week's mission over the Huon Gulf. Hayes had been bounced by a Japanese Zero during that sortie. The nimble enemy fighter had nearly killed him. Hayes yanked the yoke hard, but for a frightening moment the Lightning didn't respond, its roll rate sluggish. He escaped with a few bullet holes in the tail and a new understanding. The P-38 simply could not turn inside a Zero. The Imperial Japanese Navy's Mitsubishi. A 6M0 was a featherlight acrobat of the sky, famed for its tight turning radius and agility. American pilots in the Pacific Theater had learned the hard way never to dogfight a Zero on its own terms. Early in the war, U.S. flyers made the mistake of trying to turn and burn with the Japanese, often with fatal results. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's great aces, noted that when the strange twin-boomed P-38s first appeared in late 1942, American pilots attempted to dogfight and were picked off by the more maneuverable Zeros groups. Google.com. That painful lesson of burning P-38s, as Sakai put it, forced a change in U.S. tactics groups. Google.com. By 1943, Allied pilots were instructed to use the Lightning's strengths, speed, firepower, climb, and dive, to hit the enemy and zoom away, rather than swirling and turning duels. The P-38's twin supercharged engines gave it a blistering climb rate and high-altitude performance the Zero couldn't match. And in a dive, the Lightning was faster by far. Indeed, pilots had to mind the onset of compressibility. Colonel MacDonald at 5th Fighter Command drilled into new pilots. Keep your altitude, keep your speed. Don't try to turn with a Zero, make him turn with you. These doctrines were beginning to pay off. Battles like the interception over Oro Bay in March 1943 proved that when used wisely, the P-38 could be dominant. That day, Allied P-38 and P-40 covering Oro Bay shot down at least a dozen Japanese planes and scattered a bomber formation with minimal losses. nla.gov.au, trove.nla.gov.au. And on April 18, 1943, P-38s had executed Operation Vengeance, the famous long-range intercept that killed Admiral Yamamoto, showcasing the Lightning's unrivaled reach. The P-38 was earning a reputation as the one Allied fighter that could challenge Japan's air superiority in the New Guinea campaign. But those hard-won victories did not erase the anxious knowledge shared in fighter revetments across the Pacific. Up close, at low speeds, a skilled Zero pilot could still dance around a Lightning. Pilots like Hayes knew this. Many had seen a comrade's P-38 spiral down in flames after trying to outturn a seemingly archaic Japanese plane. And McKenna, who listened to the debriefs and patched bullet holes in returned aircraft, knew it too. This morning, as he watched Lieutenant Hayes clamber up to his cockpit, McKenna decided he couldn't let his pilot face the enemy with that handicap if he could fix it. He reached into his toolbox and felt for a length of steel wire he'd scavenged from a wrecked aircraft's piano hinge. It was about 6 inches long, springy, high-tensile wire. With quick hands, McKenna bent the wire into a Z-shaped zigzag. His idea was simple: create a makeshift spring to take up that excess slack in the aileron control cables. Working swiftly under the wing, hidden from the busy commotion of pre-flight checks, he spliced the Z-shaped wire into the aileron cable run as an improvised tensioner. It wasn't in any manual, and it certainly wasn't by the book. In fact, it violated multiple maintenance regulations to alter flight controls without engineering approval. McKenna knew if his crew chief or the squadron engineering officer caught him, he could face serious disciplinary action. But he also remembered the letters he had helped write to grieving families, explaining that a pilot was missing in action. If this tiny tweak could save Hayes' life today, it was worth the risk. He tightened a last screw just as the ground crew chief came by on final inspection. McKenna nonchalantly closed the access panel. The entire modification had taken perhaps 8 minutes, and he doubted anyone would notice at a glance. The inspectors that morning were focused on fuel, armaments, and the temperamental engines. None thought to crawl into the wing to gauge cable tension, Facebook.com. Indeed, nobody noticed. Moments later, Lieutenant Hayes taxied his Lightning to the runway, unaware of the secret tweak hidden in its control lines. McKenna stood at the edge of the strip, heart pounding as the P-38's twin engines roared. He made a final, perhaps superstitious, salute as Hayes thundered off into the humid sky to join formation. This mission was a big one. Over 80 Lightnings were streaking northward today to cover B-25 Mitchell bombers in a daring strike against Japanese airfields around WWII. WWII was the enemy's main forward airbase on New Guinea, bristling with fighters. In recent weeks, the Japanese had reinforced it with dozens of Zeros and Oscars to contest Allied advances. The Allies, in turn, were determined to neutralize WWII in preparation for an upcoming ground offensive against LAPacificRex.com. It was sure to be a slugfest in the skies, exactly the kind of melee where a split-second edge could decide who lived and who died. McKenna watched until Hayes' P-38 disappeared into the blue, then busied himself with the long day of waiting and worry that every ground crewman knew too well. Up in the morning sun over the northern coast of New Guinea, Lieutenant Hayes scanned the skies, adrenaline coursing. Below, the green jungles around WWII sparkled with bomb blasts as B-25s pounded enemy runways. His squadron of P-38s circled high cover. Suddenly, specks appeared, diving out of the glare. Japanese fighters rushing to defend WWII. Hayes' throat went dry. There were at least a dozen Zeros forming up, and more twin-engined Kai-45 Nick fighters rising from the airstrip despite the bombs. The American Lightning pilots wheeled to meet them, engines howling as they poured on speed. A furious dogfight exploded over the coastline. Tracers flashed by Hayes' canopy. Instinctively, he hauled the control yoke left to break into an onrushing Zero's attack. And at that moment, he felt something different. The P-38 responded at once, almost snappy, with none of the mushiness he'd come to expect. The yoke wasn't slack. It felt taut, immediate. His left wing flicked up and the Zero's gunnery pass missed wide. For the first time in his P-38 career, Hayes had no delay in his roll control. Surprise and relief flickered through his mind, but training took over. He kicked the Lightning into a hard climbing turn, throttles to the firewall. The Zero tried to follow, but the Lightning gained altitude rapidly. Within seconds, Hayes was above his pursuer. He flipped into a diving turn, the kind of high-speed maneuver P-38s used to their advantage, and the Lightning rolled into position like a ballet dancer. The 20mm cannon in its nose erupted, and the Zero burst into flame and tumbled earthward. Hayes whooped aloud, his first kill of the day. Almost immediately, a cry came over the radio. "Bogies on your 6!" 2 more cream-colored Zeros were tailing Hayes. He shoved the yoke forward and dove for the deck, his lightning accelerating with a howl as the enemy pilots gave chase. In the past, a Lightning pilot's best move in this situation was a steep power dive. The Zero's radial engine would struggle to keep up, and its airframe might rip apart if it tried. Hayes did exactly that. The airspeed indicator needle swung deep into the red. The canopy rattled. This was the P-38's notorious compressibility zone. But thanks to emergency dive flaps installed in newer models, he managed to keep control. One Zero pilot wisely broke off, but the other was hell-bent on the kill and stayed with him longer than expected. Hayes leveled out just above the jungle canopy, then pulled up sharply into a zoom climb. Normally, the Lightning's controls would feel heavy in such a high G pull-up, but he noticed his aileron still biting, letting him adjust aim. The overeager Zero tried to pull up in front of him. An error. Hayes seized the moment, rolling inverted and slicing in behind the climbing Zero. In a flash, he had the enemy in his sights and fired a burst. 50 caliber tracers tore into the Zero's wing root, and it cartwheeled into the trees. 2 down. Hayes took a breath. All those hours of gunnery practice and boom and zoom discipline were paying off. But he also felt the difference in his plane today. It was responding crisply, almost like the control cables had become alive. Above him, the melee raged. Dozens of contrails and twisting aircraft sketched white arches in the tropical sky. The remaining Japanese fighters were now badly outnumbered. Many had been blown from the air in the first head-on passes by the Lightning groups. Hayes spotted a lone Zero trying to flee eastward at low altitude, likely a veteran pilot who had seen enough. With a predatory focus, Hayes dove after him. The Japanese flyer jettisoned his drop tank and juked desperately, but this time, the Lightning hung with each evasive turn. Hayes grunted against the G-forces, the control yoke steady in his grip. In a climbing left bank, he closed in and fired. Cannon shells clipped the Zero's tail. The enemy pilot rolled right into a dive, a classic Zero escape move, but Hayes rolled right with him, no slack in his controls to spoil the timing. A quick trigger squeeze and the Zero disintegrated in midair. 3rd kill. The entire swirling engagement had lasted only minutes, though to Hayes it felt like an eternity. Later, back at base, he would discover he'd downed all 3 in barely 7 minutes of combatfreerepublic.com. The surviving Japanese fighters were in full retreat or hiding in clouds. Hayes formed up with his squadron mates, who were buzzing with elation. Below, the Wewak airfields lay devastated. U.S. bombs and strafing had wrecked dozens of enemy planes on the ground. Indeed, in the multi-day Wewak raid, 5th Air Force claimed over 90 Japanese aircraft destroyed, half of them shot down in aerial combat by the P-38 escorts in .wikipedia.org. As Hayes headed homeward, he marveled at the Lightning's performance. What had changed? The big fighter felt nimble as never before. He suspected his own adrenaline, or perhaps just luck. Either way, he silently thanked whoever or whatever was responsible for the newfound edge. When the P-38s finally returned to Dobodura that afternoon, the airfield erupted in excitement. Ground crew and pilots from other squadrons gathered around, peppering the returning flyers with questions. Hayes had barely popped open his canopy when he was hoisted onto the shoulders of a jubilant comrade. 3 victories in 1 sortie made him an ace in a day, counting 2 earlier kills. A rare feat. McKenna rushed out to the flight line, equal parts relieved and anxious. He helped guide Hayes' mud-splattered Lightning into its revetment. As the pilot climbed down, McKenna couldn't resist asking, "How'd she fly, sir?" Hayes removed his helmet, face flush with excitement and residual shock. "Jim, it was unbelievable," he exclaimed. Other pilots crowded around as Hayes recounted the dogfight. "She rolled like a dream today. No delay, none of that usual slop in the stick," he said, moving his hand as if jiggling the yoke. McKenna felt a surge of vindication and allowed himself the slightest grin. Hayes continued, eyes wide. "I could feel every input. I swear it turned quicker. I was on those Zeros before they knew it." At this, a captain pushed through the small crowd, Captain Frank Mitchell, the squadron's operations officer. A seasoned fighter pilot himself, Mitchell had a keen ear for anything that might give his men an advantage, but he also wore the wary expression of an officer responsible for keeping both pilots and machines in one piece. "Lieutenant," Mitchell interjected, "what's that you're saying about the controls?" Hayes, suddenly aware of possibly overstepping, replied, "Sir, I don't know exactly, but my ship felt tighter today. More responsive. Like the controls had no slack." Mitchell arched an eyebrow. His gaze drifted to McKenna, who stood casually by the wingtip, wiping his hands on an oily rag. McKenna's heart skipped. He knew that look. "Sergeant McKenna," the captain said evenly, "what do you make of the lieutenant's observation?" Jim McKenna was not a man prone to lying, and certainly not to an officer he respected. He took a breath. "Sir, I think I might have an idea," he said. "With your permission." Mitchell nodded slowly. McKenna opened the left boom's access panel and pointed. I added a little something here." Hayes peered in, eyes widening as he saw the shiny Z-shaped wire spliced into the cable assembly. Captain Mitchell's face was unreadable. A long moment of silence hung under the wing. Nearby, mechanics pretended not to eavesdrop, and a few pilots held their breath. "You're telling me," Mitchell finally said, "that you modified the flight controls on this aircraft? On your own initiative?" His tone was stern, but beneath it McKenna detected a layer of intrigue. "Yes, sir," McKenna answered firmly. There was no point in equivocation. He explained how he'd noticed the excessive play in the aileron cables, how every P-38 had it by design, and how he believed it was undermining their pilots in combat. "It was only about 3/8 of an inch of slack, sir, but enough to kill," McKenna said, almost quoting the thoughts he'd kept to himself for weeks, freerepublic.com. He described the physics. That initial dead zone before the ailerons bit into the airflow could delay a roll or maneuver by critical fractions of a second. At high speeds, it might not matter as much, but in low-speed, high-angle engagements, exactly where Zeros excelled, it could be fatal. "All I did was put a slight tension in the cable," McKenna concluded, showing the little wire spring. "It only adds maybe half a pound of force. The stick might feel a touch stiffer on the ground, but it's instant response." Hayes slapped his palm on the wing and laughed. "I knew something was different." Captain Mitchell rubbed his chin. As the implications sank in, a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He was known as a bit of a maverick himself. After all, this was the same Frank Mitchell who had once bent the rules by mounting improvised bomb racks on his P-40 back in '42 to hit a Japanese supply dump. He appreciated battlefield ingenuity. Still, he had to uphold discipline. Mitchell cleared his throat. "Sergeant, you realize doing this without approval is against every regulation in the book." McKenna met his eye. "Yes, sir. I'll accept whatever reprimand you think is due." Another pause. Then Mitchell broke into a grin and clapped McKenna on the shoulder. "Reprimand? Hell, I ought to pin a medal on you. You probably saved lives today." The gathered men exhaled in relief and a couple cheered. Mitchell, keeping his voice low, added, "But listen, we'd better keep this unofficial. At least for now. If Group HQ asks, Lieutenant Hayes just had a lucky day, understood?" The captain winked. McKenna nodded, understanding that officially nothing had changed, but in truth, everything had. That evening, long after the sun set behind the Owen Stanley Range, a covert revolution began to spread through the 5th Air Force's fighter squadrons. Word of Hayes' triumph and the little wire trick traveled by the hushed grapevine of the enlisted ground crews. In 10 hangars lit by Coleman lamps, crew chiefs from other P-38 squadrons cornered McKenna to hear about the fix. He demonstrated the Z-bend wire technique to a select few trusted NCOs. A 6-inch length of piano wire and 8 minutes of work. That was it. By the end of August, dozens of Lightnings at WWII and neighboring airstrips had their aileron cables quietly modified in the same manner, freerepublic.com. It was an insurgency of innovation, entirely grassroots. No directives came from above. Official Army Air Forces channels remained oblivious for now. The pilots, for their part, definitely noticed the difference. "Feels like a new plane," one combat-weary ace remarked after test flying a tweaked P-38. With the slack removed from their controls, the Lightnings now waltz through maneuvers that used to require manhandling. It didn't make the bulky twin-engine fighter magically outturn a Zero in a sustained turning circle. Physics still imposed limits, but it eliminated that annoying hesitation at the start of a roll or break. In dogfights, that initial quick snap often meant getting the first shot or evading an attacker's gunsight. Morale soared. Less than a year earlier, many American pilots privately feared the Zero. Now they felt the Lightning had finally come into its own as an equal, even superior foe. "It's like we've cured the 38's arthritis," joked Captain Mitchell to his squadron CO. "She's nimble when she needs to be." Indeed, by early September 1943, at least 40 P-38 Lightnings across New Guinea had the unofficial cable mod in place, freerepublic.com. The impact was soon reflected in combat results. Throughout September and October, as the Allies pressed their offensive, P-38 squadrons slashed through Japanese air opposition with growing confidence. During the brutal fighting over the Huon Gulf, supporting the Australian-American invasion of Lae and Finschhafen, Lightning pilots relished the more responsive handling of their machines. In one engagement near Finschhafen, a group of 4 P-38s was bounced by a swarm of roughly 10 Japanese Army Kai 43 Oscars, close cousins of the Zero, also extremely maneuverable. Normally the odds might have spelled trouble, but this time the American pilots held their own, turning sharply to cover each other and shooting down several attackers while losing none. One pilot credited the cable tweak. "We could snap roll into them when they tried to get on our tails. That little delay used to kill us, but now it's gone." It wasn't all the wire, of course. Improved tactics and experience played a major role, but the mod became a psychological edge as well. Knowing their Lightning would answer instantly gave pilots the courage to push the aircraft closer to the edge in combat. Back at headquarters, Major General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, was noticing a remarkable trend. The kill-loss ratio in the New Guinea air battles was improving dramatically in late 1943. Later analysis of unit records suggested that where previously it might take on average 2 Lightning sorties to down one enemy, a roughly 1-to-2 exchange in early skirmishes, by autumn 1943 the ratio in many fights had evened out or tilted decisively in the Americans' favor freerepublic.com. Some of this was due to better pilot training and the attrition of Japan's veteran flyers. But whispers of a mysterious wire fix circulated in the ready rooms. A fix that, as one squadron memo put it, has greatly reduced the lag-in control response on our P-38s, enabling pilots to achieve kills they might have missed before. Eventually, of course, the news reached those higher up in the maintenance echelons. Late one September afternoon, a visiting engineering inspector at an air depot near Port Moresby stumbled upon an odd-looking Z-shaped addition in a P-38's wing. Perplexed, he wrote up a report on the unauthorized modification and forwarded it up the chain. As duty required, freerepublic.com. The paper trail made it to Brisbane HQ, landing on a colonel's desk. Where it sat and sat, for over a month, freerepublic.com. By the time anyone in authority truly investigated, the operational situation had rendered the issue moot. The 5th Air Force brass knew the P-38 squadrons were enjoying unprecedented success. Why interfere? In fact, one staff officer joked that perhaps the unauthorized tweak should be encouraged, not punished. Unofficially, a message went out to let the matter be. The Army Air Forces had learned to trust the ingenuity of its people in the field, a culture exemplified by countless small fixes and battlefield inventions. As long as the Lightnings kept shooting down Zeros and coming home, nobody was going to court-martial a crew chief for a piece of wire. This was war, and winning it took priority over red tape. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, were learning a terrifying new reality. The once vaunted Zero was losing its edge. Veteran ace Saburo Sakai, after recovering from wounds, heard reports from the front lines that deeply unsettled him. By the late months of 1943, American P-38s were dominating the skies at high altitude and choosing when to engage. It was no longer possible for Zero fighters to successfully engage the P-38s, except under the most unusual conditions. Sakai later wrote groups.google.com. He noted with grudging respect that once the Americans understood the Lightning's advantages, they used them to plunge from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters, fighting on their own terms. Groups.google.com. The Lightning could outrun, outclimb, and outdive the Zero. And now, even in close quarters, it reacted faster than before. Sakai described how the P-38 would patrol above the altitude ceiling of the Zero, then dive with impunity. The Zero's famed turning agility was useless if it couldn't get an American in its sights. Groups.google.com. Groups.google.com. Other Japanese aces like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Toshio Ota, who had once laughed at the bulky Lightning, suddenly found it a daunting foe. In fact, intelligence intercepts later revealed that Japanese commanders issued new directives warning pilots to avoid dogfighting P-38 at all costs by late 1943. Facebook.com. A captured Japanese document from October 1943 advised Zero pilots to employ hit-and-run tactics and never try to turn with the twin-engine Lightning, essentially admitting that the tables had turned. The morale of Japan's airmen began to falter. One Japanese diary recorded a pilot lamenting, "Those fork-tailed devils, they don't give us a chance anymore." Saburo Sakai himself acknowledged the shift in stark terms. He was astonished to find an American aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive our Zero, which we thought was the most superior fighter plane in the world. The Lightning's speed and high-altitude performance presented insuperable problems for Japanese flyers, and its ability to dictate the engagement destroyed the morale of the Zero fighter pilot. Sakai wrote warbirds.orgwarbirds.org. No longer did Japanese pilots view the P-38 as a ponderous gaijin contraption. Now it was a predator to be feared. On the Allied side, the momentum was palpable. As 1943 turned into 1944, the Americans achieved air superiority in the Southwest Pacific. P-38 Lightning units led the way in escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, strafing Japanese airfields and covering amphibious landings on new beaches. The Lightning had become the quintessential Pacific workhorse. Top American aces like Major Richard Dick Bong and Major Thomas McGuire piled up victory tallies in P-38s that eclipsed anything seen in the Pacific War to date. Bong would finish with 40 aerial victories, all achieved in Lightning cockpits. Warbirds.org. And he, like many others, credited the aircraft's robust design and continual improvements for his survival. By mid-1944, Lockheed engineers had rolled out the new P-38J model, incorporating many enhancements learned from field experience. Among these were power-boosted ailerons and small dive flaps to counter compressibility. Warbirds.org. Less publicly mentioned was a subtle change to the aileron control system. Lockheed added springs and improved tension regulators to eliminate the slack that McKenna and his fellows had identified. FreeRepublic.com. In essence, the stupid little wire trick had been absorbed into official design. The Army Air Forces might never openly celebrate an enlisted mechanic for correcting an oversight in a $100,000 fighter, but the knowledge had not been lost. Future American aircraft would pay more attention to control responsiveness, a legacy of those New Guinea experiments. In fact, flight control tensioning springs became standard in many post-war designs. Engineers and test pilots in later decades, likely unaware of McKenna, proved through wind tunnel and flight tests what he had grasped on a sweltering jungle morning. Even a small delay or slack in controls can sharply reduce an aircraft's effectiveness. In combat. FreeRepublic.com. FreeRepublic.com. As for Technical Sergeant McKenna, he continued to serve through the end of the New Guinea campaign and into the Philippines' liberation. He kept a low profile, content with the quiet pride that his handiwork had possibly saved lives. Some said he eventually earned a battlefield commission. Others that he went home to California after the war and opened an auto garage, fitting for a man whose mechanical skill had altered the course of aerial combat. Within the squadron, McKenna was regarded with genuine affection and respect. Pilots would seek him out before missions, jokingly asking if he had any other magic wires up his sleeve. McKenna would just smile and tell them to give those Zero boys hell. By war's end, the legend of the piano wire fix had spread throughout the 5th Air Force. Many knew the broad strokes. One resourceful mechanic's 8-minute hack had helped Lightnings wrestle the Zero from its throne. Some pilots credited McKenna with their very lives, saying that without the improved control response, they might not have evaded that one tight spot in a dogfight. Historians later estimated that 80 to 100 American pilots' lives were saved thanks to the wire trick's widespread adoption. FreeRepublic.com. FreeRepublic.com. A difficult figure to prove, perhaps, but not unreasonable given the sharp drop in P-38 losses during latter half of 1943. It became a favorite anecdote in Air Force circles, highlighting how a frontline innovation, born outside official protocols, tipped the balance in the Pacific Air War. In the post-war years, as the U.S. Air Force formalized, there was an increasing appreciation for feedback from the field. The ghost of McKenna's Z-wire lived on in that ethos. When GIS in Korea sandbagged their jet airbase revetments, or Vietnam-era crews jury-rigged engine filters against dust, they were following in the footsteps of tinkerers like McKenna, who solved immediate problems with whatever they had on hand. On a sunny morning decades later, a restored P-38 Lightning sat on display at an air show, gleaming in olive drab and sporting the twin lightning bolt insignia of the old 5th Air Force. A veteran pilot was regaling a small crowd with tales of the South Pacific. "The Lightning was a splendid ship," the gray-haired ace said, "but let me tell you about a clever sergeant who made it even better." He described the control cable fix in loving detail, eyes shining with the memory of fallen comrades and the ingenuity that helped even the odds. In the back of the crowd, an elderly gentleman with grease-stained hands, James McKenna himself, though few knew it, listened quietly with a satisfied smile. The storyteller concluded, "Sometimes the smallest thing can change the course of a fight. A 6-inch piece of wire in this case. We pilots got the glory, but it was men like McKenna who kept us alive." The audience broke into applause as the old mechanic wiped a tear from his eye, modestly ducking away. His legacy was secure, not in medals or headlines, but in every life saved and every victory won, because a P-38 pilot could roll just a little bit quicker when it mattered most. And so ends this extraordinary chapter of World War II history, a tale of innovation, bravery, and teamwork that turned the tide in the Pacific skies. Thank you for listening to World War II History Retold. If you enjoyed the story of Technical Sergeant McKenna's Little Wire That Could, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more in-depth wartime narratives. From the steamy jungles of New Guinea to the vast expanse of the Pacific, countless untold stories like this await, each one a tribute to the ingenuity and courage of those who served. Join us next time on World War II History Retold, where we bring history's hidden moments to life. Until then, thanks for watching, and stay curious.